So hi everybody, welcome. My name is David Randle. I'm at the American Museum of Natural History and I work here on teacher programs, so different programs where teachers come in for face-to-face professional development. I also work on the Seminars on Science program, which is an online program of graduate courses for teachers. And so pretty much anything to do with teachers at the museum, I have some kind of a toe in. What I want to talk to you today about is a set of tools that we developed a few years ago, actually, kind of at the onset of NGSS, before NGSS curriculum was starting to be rolled out. And it was sort of a response to a need that was perceived for, curriculum that was aligned to the NGSS. And so along with Carnegie's support and in a collaboration with BSCS and the K-12 Alliance at WestEd, we embarked on a pretty major project to try to put together a set of tools that would help teachers, curriculum developers, anybody that was interested in translating the NGSS into instruction and classroom assessment. So I think the word people are using today is NGSS designed curriculum. So these tools would help someone who's interested in designing curriculum around any of the standards to put together NGSS designed instruction. So I'll kind of give you an overview of it, but basically there we go. The idea is, so here's one standards page, and we'll kind of use middle school ecosystems as a model. It's the one that we use when we're just doing kind of process-oriented professional learning on the 5 tools. So if you just came and you wanted to go through a week session to learn about the 5 tools, we'd kind of use this as a model. If someone was interested in doing more extended professional development, we would have you do professional learning and learn the tools while you're designing curriculum in a subject that is interesting to you and something that you plan on using. So we've done both kinds of professional learning, and I can talk a little bit about that during the talk. But the idea here is the NGSS has come up with these standards pages, and there's the 3 dimensions down at the bottom, the practices, the disciplinary core ideas, the cross-cutting concept, which are like these, concepts and ideas and things that scientists do. So the idea now is that students will learn the disciplinary core ideas while engaging in the practices and applying the cross-cutting concepts. So how do we do that? And then, of course, we have the performance expectations up at the top there, which are tasks that I think they're more aimed, toward district or large-scale assessment efforts to design assessments related to that. But so as instructional designers or teachers, like how do we put together instruction that sort of incorporates all these so we can take care of the 3 dimensions at the bottom while preparing our students for the performance expectations on the top? And so there's a lot here. And so how do we do that in a way that makes sense? And so we have these set of tools, the 5 tools and processes for translating the NGSS into instruction and classroom assessment. And this is from our website. Everything that I'm going to talk about here is pretty much available for free on this website. So all so there's sets of slides, there's card decks, which I'll talk about in a little bit. There are facilitator guides for doing the professional learning. There's all the tools. There's all the handouts and everything that would go with, that you would need in order to engage in this process, whether as somebody who would facilitate it for teachers or just as a group of teachers and instructional designers who would want to do it on your own. So it's all there, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's there. But so here's scrolling down farther down the page. You'll see all the information for all the tools. There's some models, implementation models that I'll talk about near the end that are sort of adaptations of and rearrangements of some of the different tools for different purposes. And so we'll kind of talk about that near the end here. But I wanted to give you kind of a broad overview of the 5 tools, so introduce you to the tools as a way to design instruction and assessment. And near the end, I'll kind of talk about ways that the 5 tools and processes can be used with teachers and instructional designers. And so the big goals of the 5 tools, it's sort of twofold. I've talked a little bit about designing curriculum that's specifically for NGSS-based instruction, and that's important, but also through the 5 tool process, it's really designed to deepen your understanding of the NGSS and increase your abilities to teach in this new way that the standards are sort of asking us to teach in. Oops. All right, so one of the things that we do sort of at the beginning of any of the 5 tools and is to sort of ask people to think about what they think about when they're planning a unit of instruction. And people tell us a lot of different things, but the things that come up pretty consistently are the standardized test that their students have to take at the end of the year or half a year or whatever their school year is broken up into. They often design curriculum around their favorite activities. So I have this thing that I do on ecosystems, and I love it, and the kids love it, and that's a big part of my unit. Things like understanding what the students already know and what they've done in the past come up in this section as well. But the question is sort of really important in sort of getting people to sort of like do a reset about where they're at before they're ready to kind of move on to a new way of planning curriculum. So we always include this in our professional learning, whether it's designing their own curriculum or whether it's going through just learning the process with the ecosystem stuff. So this is from the Appendix A in the NGSS. So we always want to spend a little bit of time first sort of thinking about, what's the NGSS asking us to do that's a little bit different? And I'm not going to read these. I'll leave them up long enough so that you can kind of scan through them. But the big idea here is that there's this idea of integration. With some people, when you just look at a standards page and don't dive really deep into the NGSS, you don't realize that in the appendices there's guides for pacing. There's guides for what's the word, for progressions, so from one grade to another. And so there's a lot there, and that's part of the whole conceptual shift. So it's not only this 3-dimensional way that we're supposed to be teaching, but it's kind of really the idea of deeper understanding, integrating science and engineering into the instruction as well. So there's a lot there that teachers are now being asked to do, and instructional designers are being asked to do, that's a little bit new to the community. So the 5 tools is sort of one way to sort of get at helping people understand the shifts and sort of plan instruction for these shifts. And so there's sort of a couple dimensions to the 5 tools. So as you can see in the name, it has something to do with planning for assessment and planning for instruction. And so the tools themselves, so in tool 1, basically you come up with an idea, we call it a blueprint, so a 3-dimensional blueprint, so it's going to incorporate all the elements of the standards. It's a conceptual flow, really. So it's not instruction, it's not lesson plans, it's basically a map through whatever topic you're using in a conceptual arrangement that you think makes sense to your students. So that's tool 1. Tool 1's kind of the big bear. It lays the foundation for all the rest of them, and it has kind of the most moving parts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of dive into each of the tools. Tool 2, we sort of take a step back and think about how we're going to assess what we think the kids should learn. So we come up with these evidence of learning specifications. They're not assessments, so we're not doing strict backward design where we come up with the assessment first, but we are, before we do anything else, thinking about what we're going to look for from our students in order to see what they learned. Tool 3, we start thinking about a little more clearly about the assessment. So a couple of the big things that come out of Tool 3 are this idea about the phenomena. We focus on the story that's developing, and we introduce an instructional model. And since the 5 tools was developed with BSCS, we lean on the 5E instructional model. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so basically at the end of Tool 3, you'll take what you came up with in Tool 1, and on each of your lesson units, or what would be a 5E sequence, you come up with a conceptual flow for that. Tool 4, we really kind of start digging in and developing the lessons. So once again, we apply the 5E model, and you kind of really get into like, what are the activities that you would use to teach those models. And there's some tools for each of the 5Es that allow you to do some analysis of stuff that you might have laying around. So I have this great lesson that I always teach on ecosystems. Does it really fit into my conceptual flow now? And so this is the point in the 5 tools. So it seems like pretty far along, but now we're starting to get into like the details of what is in each of the lessons. And then finally, the Tool 5 is where we develop our assessments around all this stuff. So it's quite a process. When we've used it with teachers to develop actual curriculum, it's taken several months. Yeah, so the whole process, if you're using it actually, you need some time for people to work in the middle, so it may take several months. If you can get through this as using an example. So like I said, a lot of times we use the ecosystem example. You can get through that in a full week of professional learning. So we'll kind of dive in, and I'll tell you a little bit about each tool more specifically before I kind of branch off into some of the things that we've used it for. So Tool 1, as I said, is this idea of developing a 3-dimensional blueprint. And the goals, the big goal of a lot of the 5 tools is to help people understand the NGSS. They come up with like basically this blueprint of concepts. So the concepts that they would teach and organized into the order that they would teach them in. And the first thing that happens, and this picture shows people using this activity with yellow sticky notes. And the first thing you do is we honor teachers' own experience. So you don't want to really start off by telling teachers what they're going to teach. And so we have them come up with their own ideas about a certain subject. So these folks, this was a leadership institute, so they were all doing ecosystems. So they're all kind of thinking about what are the concepts that they would use to teach middle school ecosystems. And so they wrote each concept on an individual sticky note, and then those sticky notes get arranged according to how they would teach them. And what I want to do is I want to share with you like a digital version of this that we did, so you can kind of get an idea of how it might go. And switch platforms here. There we go. So this is, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but this is a screen capture from an online version we did of Tool 1 that kind of tested out as a concept. So we're using a platform called Mural, and it's basically a digital whiteboard that I'll kind of share a little bit more about as we get into it. But we use this as our digital platform for an online version of Tool 1 that we did. And so everybody recorded their thoughts here, and the teachers were involved in talking to each other through Zoom. And so there was a conversation going on that you're not going to be able to hear, but you're going to be able to hear. So I'm going to kind of go through what was kind of an hour of work in a few seconds here, just so you can kind of see how the flow. But so each one of these piles of yellow sticky notes is one teacher's thoughts on Earth systems. So they wrote down the concepts that they would teach to the kids that they teach on these yellow sticky notes. And then they had to zoom in a little bit so they could actually read each other's work. And it gets kind of messy, but you can kind of see how over the course of the hour, they would group sticky notes together. So sticky notes that were sort of talking about the same things. They put green headings on that, on the top. It sort of indicated a topic within this. And so you can kind of see as the hour progressed, that some order starts to develop for all their sticky notes. Then they begin to move them around into the order that they would teach them in. And so what you end up with is these columns that are topics that would be roughly sort of one or 2 weeks of instruction. So when we're talking 5E models, like one of these columns might be like one time through the 5E sequence. So that's the first part of 201. So it's the teacher's ideas. And then let me pop back to my other back to the PowerPoint here. Can you see that? Okay. And the next step would be to look at the elements from the standards. So there's cards, and near the end, I'll kind of share with you some of the templates for these cards in Mural that you can take advantage of if you'd like. But on the cards, one card deck for ecosystems is like this. So we have this many cards. They're all the different cards. The one that you see now is a DCI card. There's cards for the performance expectations. So all the different performance expectations that would be involved with MSLS2, all the practices, all the cross-cutting concepts. We get down into ideas of nature of science and even connections to the Common Core as well. And this is sort of what it looks like when you end up in the analog version of it, is you have these papers with the cards sort of covering or not covering the sticky notes, depending on if they are dealing with the same thing. And so this group in particular, so this is a group that did climate change. But so here would be sort of one 5E sequence. Here would be another one. I think this goes with that. It would be another. So this is like, sort of 4 times through the 5E cycle. So it's kind of messy. The conversation is really cool when you're able to listen in on how teachers are talking about this kind of stuff. And what you end up with is something that looks like, ended up transferring it into a document that's something right here. This is the top of it would go on for 4 or 5 pages. So this is just the performance expectations, and then within one column. So here's one sequence here. It would go on the next thing that would be there would be the DCIs, and then the practices and the crosscuts, all the way down to connections to the Common Core. So that sort of in a, oops, sorry, come on. Okay. Yeah, so then in a nutshell is 201. So 202 is where we start to come up with what we're going to assess. And the 202 actually starts off with a really fun activity where we ask people to think about, we come up with kind of a fake performance expectation that has to do with planning a dinner party. And we ask teachers to tell us what they would look for as evidence that somebody has successfully planned a dinner party. And you can imagine that the conversation kind of, like some groups, like actually look for the evidence of executing a successful dinner party, and some people actually come up with things that would actually be involved in the plan, like a guest list and a seating chart and a menu and a shopping list and things like that. So it's a really kind of fun activity that uses a real life example, not that science isn't real life, but uses an everyday example, I guess, of something that it kind of gets into the nuance of the vocabulary. So when we're testing students, when we're coming up with our assessments for our students, we need to be really careful about what we're actually assessing. So we're actually assessing what we're asking the students to do. And that's sort of what Tool 2 is all about. So during Tool 2, you basically break down the performance expectations. And so down here, you can kind of see that we've broken up using the colors of the NGSS. So the orange would be, the DCIs, the green is the cross-cutting concepts, and the blue is the practices. And so we kind of can go through a process of breaking down each performance expectation, figuring out what that we want to foreground, what's going to be in the background, and what's not assessed. And so you have this chart for all the performance expectations that might be involved. You pull them off your blueprint and kind of look, and so you end up with this chart here that you'll kind of set aside once you do it, but it sort of gives you the things that you will assess at the end of your instruction. So that's basically Tool 2. Tool 3 is also kind of a bear. There's a lot of learning involved in Tool 3, and once you've gone through it, it becomes a little easier the second and third time because you don't have to do a lot of the initial learning. But we start Tool 3 with a learning activity about the 5E model and about conceptual flow using 2 scenarios. So you may have heard of Miss Rivera. Miss Rivera is gaining some notoriety. This is where Miss Rivera comes from. So Miss Rivera is a middle school science teacher. And what we do is we have people break down 7 of her lessons. So it's basically sort of a 1 5E sequence. A couple of the E's get repeated. And you can see on this chart that you're breaking it down according to sort of what the teacher does, what the student does, and what the science that's being taught is. And we compare Miss Rivera to one of her colleagues, Mr. Coles, who is also teaching the same thing, but in a different way. Mr. Coles is a little bit more teacher-centered. He has some good activities, and he's a good teacher, but it is a little more traditional. And so a lot of the activity is involved with comparing Mr. Coles and Ms. Rivera, and we end up kind of focusing on Ms. Rivera to kind of look at what the elements of the 5E model are in her lessons. And so the process takes you through that. A lot of it's kind of involved in kind of looking at that. There's an activity in Tool 3 that allows you to sort of look at anchoring phenomena. So sort of we call it a concept attainment activity that kind of gives examples of different things. And there's some facilitator guided questions that help you sort of like suss out exactly what a phenomena is on a lesson level and on a unit level. And then what you come up with at the end, so in association with kind of for your lessons, is like within one of those columns that I talked about, that's 1 5E, you would come up with the conceptual flow within that column. So that's what gets filled in at the tool at the end. So you have the elements of the story, the concepts that flow, you have the practices that are being used. And here's also where you're not thinking about particular lessons yet, but it's hard for teachers not to do that. And so there's a place for teachers to kind of start entering the kind of resources that they have available, that they know of, that may apply to each of the pieces for each of their instructional sequences. All right. And so this is partly kind of what that looks like. Sorry, this is, so then on to Tool 4. So Tool 4, we begin to sort of break down what the actual lessons are. And it starts with an activity that sort of looks back at what you did in analyzing Ms. Rivera's sequence and kind of pulling out the different pieces of the standards. So you can't really read what's written on these, but knowing the standards, you can imagine that the colors, so each of the orange ones is a DCI that was dealt with at that point in the lesson. Each of the green ones is a cross-cutting concept. The blue ones then are the practices, and the purple ones, I think in this case, are a connection to like the nature of science, or it could be Common Core. I can't remember what we used for this one, but so you're kind of breaking down what the elements of the lesson are, and eventually what you do then is the template, there's actually 5 different templates then in Tool 4, one for each of the elements of the 5 E's. So you kind of have to, so Tool 4 really expands on what you learned in Tool 3 about the 5E model. So it's like I'm saying, Tool 3 would take a lot less time if you sort of were already familiar with the 5E model, or if you already had a really good idea about how to use phenomena in classrooms. So you can kind of go right to like figuring out your the flow of each of your 5E units. But then in Tool 4, the templates actually help you with each of the lessons that that would make up your 5E sequences. So you kind of focus on one of those columns at a time, and coming up with the 5 lessons, or maybe 7 lessons if you repeat a couple E's, that would make up that sequence. And what the tool does is it sort of helps you like fit lessons that you might already have, or design lessons that you're thinking of to make sure that they fit the characteristics of each of that, each of the E's. So at which point in the lesson sequence are you, and is the activity that you're thinking about really a lesson for exploring the content? Is it more for explaining the content, or having the students explain the content? You know, it's sort of like a keep it, adapt it, toss it kind of process. So it's the place where teachers kind of really have to sort of grapple with, you know, whether their favorite lesson really fits within this instructional model or not, and is it something that they can keep on doing if they want to, you know, teach in this manner and kind of use this process. And then finally, Tool 5, we get to the assessment task. So it's actually the place where the assessment task is designed, and we start by having people do an assessment task. So once again, we're kind of using Ms. Rivera's lessons, and so here's a performance task about you know, biomes and ecosystem relationships, which is what her lessons were about. And the tool sort of leads you into coming up with the levels of performance that you would like to see, and eventually kind of what the task is that you're going to have the students do. So that's basically the 5 tools. I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the ways that it's been used to wrap up, and would love to hear from you all in ways that that you might be implementing this kind of work. But I think I've mentioned leadership institutes. So there's leadership institutes that happen periodically. We will be at NSTA this year. I'll be doing presentations with Cindy Gay from BSCS on Saturday of NSTA in St. Louis. If anybody wants to come join us, we're going to do all 5 tools in one day, so it could be a long, fun day. Also, at some of the share-a-thons, there'll be information about the 5 tools, and at the AMNH booth and at the BSCS booth, there'll be information about the 5 tools. So there may be an upcoming Leadership Institute that you would want to participate in. Tell you a little bit about some of the pilot work we've done. BSCS currently does this work in schools, and I think I mentioned that we're developing an online version of it, so that's a possibility. We've used it to design a middle school ecology curriculum called Disruptions in Ecosystems, and if you go to the Next Gen Science website, you can download that curriculum. It's available for free. It's a 5-chapter ecosystem unit that actually was used, the 5 tools was used to design that, and it's actually the chapter 1 is the one we use to model things in the leadership institutes. We use this here with our Masters in Science Teaching and Earth Science teacher folks in the Weather and Climate course, which is their last course before we turn them loose in the world. And to do unit planning, we use a sort of an adapted version of the 5 E's. And we're currently using it right now to develop a marine biology course for teachers. And then I'll talk a little bit about implementation models in a minute as well. So really quickly, I'd like to share with you some of our results from a professional learning that we did. This is the one I think that I mentioned that took like about 5 months. and we really wanted to kind of find out what happened if we brought in teams of teachers to actually design and implement curriculum. And so that's sort of what they agreed to. We met once a month. So over the course of 5 months, we went through all 5 of the tools. They had work to do in between to actually turn each tool into the product and fill out the templates and eventually come up with the lessons. And then in the spring, they taught their lessons. So these are we had 5 groups. So a couple biology groups, space systems, some energy, some forces and interactions. And we started off with 15 teachers and 4 administrators. Some of the administrators didn't make it all the way to the end. And we ended up with, I think, about 11 teachers who actually ended up doing some of this in their classrooms. And so the feedback that we got, because they came in with sort of a wide range of initial understanding of the NGSS, and we found that their awareness and understanding of the NGSS really increased. They gained a deeper vision of what the NGSS was all about. And they learned about all the tools, the variety of tools that can be used to develop NGSS designed lesson sequences. And so this is just an anecdote. At the end of Tool 3, this person really sort of gained some insight into kind of what the explained lesson in a 5E sequence was about, because they always figured that, well, it was about explaining things to the students, but he sort of came to the realization that, well, maybe it's more like that students are explaining it to themselves. So like I said, this is sort of, we ended up with 11 teachers doing some version of it. 6 completely implemented their lesson sequences, and we lost track of one of them. But basically, the ones we were able to sort of talk with in depth afterwards reported that that designing these lessons this way and teaching them was really different from anything they'd done in the past. And their instruction included more opportunities to revisit and revise work and more activities that the students kind of did their own sense making and figured out the science. So they really became sort of what Ms. Rivera did in the lessons that they analyzed during Tool 3. So it's kind of sort of really important and really transformative, I think, for some of these teachers. And so just sort of giving them a inquiry-based, instructional model. So giving them a model like the 5E model, and then giving them a structure for planning the lessons that fit into that model really, really sort of changed how they taught. So I want to share with you, so just a reminder, this is where you can find everything. So this is our website. The URL there will get you to all the resources. To be honest with you, when I go look for it, I just type in AMNH5 tools. It takes me to the same place. If you just type in 5 tools, you'll get stuff about baseball. So AMNH5 tools will take you to this spot as well. And yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the implementation model. So these were developed by BSCS, with a separate grant, I think, from Carnegie, to sort of figure out, so the 5 tool is a lot, right? And people may want to use it for different reasons. And so they came up with 3 different implementation models. So model A is sort of designed for, a full day session or 2 half-day sessions with administrators. So it's kind of a way for people who sort of need to be aware of this kind of work, or facilitate, or sort of make structural arrangements for teachers to engage in this kind of work, to sort of understand what the work is. And so Tool A sort of takes you through pieces of the 5 tools so that you understand sort of the big picture. So somebody who may not even be a science leader would understand what a phenomena-driven lesson would look like, would understand a little bit more about the new science standards, and would understand what we mean when we're talking about 3-dimensional teaching and learning. So that's kind of model A. So it's the sort of the administrator version. Model B focuses on instruction. So remember so tool 2 and tool 5 were really designed for assessment. So for model B, you would do full-blown tool 1, so come up with your conceptual flow. You would do sort of a quick version, so sort of a tool 2 light, so you know what you're going to assess. You'd also use Achieve. The NGSS has assessment statements as well. They're not bundled together, so it's kind of like the tool 2 here allows you to sort of put together sort of assessment statements that bundle different performance expectations together. But there's different ways you can kind of get at coming up with what you're going to assess. But then you would dive right into tool 3 and tool 4, so you're actually coming up with the lessons and not worrying so much about assessment. And then, as predicted, you can probably imagine that model C really gets into coming up with assessments. So creating assessments, focus on the NGSS. So you have to do tool 1, but then you spend some time really kind of digging into tool 2, and then you kind of go to tool 5 at the end there to kind of come up with the actual assessments. And so the materials for these are available on our website as well. There are teaching channel videos. So if you go to the teaching channel and once again, Google NGSS and Google 5 tools or search for 5 tools on the teaching channel, there's a couple videos that sort of take you through some professional learning that our teachers have done and sort of explain, how to use the 5 tools and kind of have, so some of the design team is involved in that, and you'll hear from teachers as well. And then I wanted to share with you our digital card decks. And so if you're interested in this, you will have to contact me and I can give you a link to it. But what I would like to do, well, we've created, and we created this for our online pilot of tool 1. So like, as I said, it's like the analog version of tool 1, you're dealing with like a whole deck of cards, and it takes you a few hours, and you eventually kind of have these cards organized in a conceptual framework for your lesson. To do this digitally, we've created a set of digital cards, once again using the Mural platform that I mentioned earlier. And this is kind of what this looks like. So here's the deck of cards all spread out in digital form. And if we kind of zoom in, you can kind of see, what teachers would be working with. And so you would start by doing the yellow sticky note activity that I showed you earlier. And then eventually you would take all these cards and kind of move them around and arrange them with your yellow sticky notes. And so you would start this out in the process. This is kind of covered with a big black box. And as you kind of needed different parts of it, you would sort of move the box to unveil in sequence, starting with the DCIs into the PEs, and then eventually the practices, the crosscuts, and then down into the connections to the nature of science and connections to Common Core standards. And so the nice thing about this is you have like sort of a digital record that you can kind of continue to come back to instead of a big messy poster with a bunch of cards taped to it. The cards are easy to edit, so you can duplicate cards if you think that a card needs to like say a DCI needs to be in a couple different lesson sequences. It's easy to do that. You can cross parts out. You can and kind of highlight things as you need to. And so we've used this with success with teachers and putting together tool 1 blueprints. Took about 5 one-hour sessions, and they were able to kind of go through a whole card deck and organize it, and then transfer it onto a document for them to use. So these are available. We have a template for, and what you would do is you would have to make a copy of this onto your own mural, which is free for educators. And then you could work on this by making a copy of any of the card decks that we have for you here. So if this is something that interests you, then contact me and I can put you in touch with how to find these things. So There we go. Slides up. Yep, so here's my email address. So anybody that has any questions about anything that I've talked about during this presentation, feel free to shoot me an email. Anybody who would like access to the digital card decks, same thing, shoot me an email and I'll share a link to that document with you, and you can kind of explore. If you have any questions about finding any of the resources involved in the 5 tools, let me know, and follow us on Twitter, and come see us at NSTA. Thanks, everybody.